You become the kind of amalgamation of the 5 people that you spend the most time with.
Let's say you meet a person and you're like, I want this person to be in my circle. How do you approach this person if you guys are not besties already?
When you're trying to, find people that you want to work with, you try to find, you think your money's gone and never getting it back, that's totally unacceptable, and people get really angry at you. This is now the cycle of delivery. And I think a lot of kind of the white paper hype and then the projects die type thing, or they can never be viable businesses type thing, I think is mostly dead. Bitcoin's at the center of it. You're using it to go get stables. It can look like a neobank. And now your Bitcoin is earning interest as well. If you don't know what the yield is, you're the yield. How many markets that are relatively untapped are $1 trillion in size today? There's not too many. And that's just such an exciting thing to really try to capture. And when are we going to get $1 million Bitcoin? Now it's like, well, I hope it's not this year. Because if it's this year, it'll change the Bitcoin market forever.
Got the whole crypto world going wild. Bonnie blockchain, she's the queen of the game. Stacking crypto like it's her claim to fame. If you want success, then take a look away.
Hi, Rich.
Hey, great to chat, Bonnie. Excited.
You said in one of your interviews that you are the 0 to 1 guy, and you started your first company at 18 years old. Can you share more about your mindset and what inspired you to do all these things?
I've been told by a bunch of people I have a very high figure it out factor. I think I've had that since I was a kid. Leave me in a room with a bunch of random toys or whatever, and I'm going to figure something out. And that's just kind of how my brain works. And kind of the corresponding element to that is when things are like totally figured out, I tend to lose interest. And that's one of the reasons that I love crypto, because it's always problem solving, right? Like you're always trying to work on some new narrative or some new technological piece for the platform. Like there's kind of a never ending problem, if you will. And that is just so conducive with how my brain works. And it's been like that since a really, really young age. And my parents were so great at giving me the amount of freedom with which to go explore my own interests without being, intrusive, if you will. And that allowed me to, go into so many different avenues. And I don't know if I've ever told this story in a podcast, but like how I actually got into coding back in the day was actually, I spent a summer like just reading books. Just like my parents said, hey, you need to get a summer job, whatever, just go read. But I found programming, eventually wrote my first iPhone apps, and kind of the history is there. It was a lot easier to make iPhone apps back in the day because there was like 1,000 apps in the store, as I make myself, old on this podcast. But yeah, it was a lot of fun, and that sort of creative freedom was definitely very key in shaping my life.
Who taught you how to code?
So I'm totally self-taught. I
Wow.
attempted to learn in college, or it didn't fully stick. So then I actually found on my own, and then all of a sudden, my brain just kind of clicked with how I think about things. But kind of the traditional learning style, was never really my thing. I'm a much more experiential person, and that's where the internet was just so important. You can just go learn anything, and again, it was an amazing time to go put those skills to use.
And you are a serial entrepreneur. So what are some businesses you've been a part of? And tell us these experiences.
So shortly after college, I cut my teeth out in San Francisco, and we had a number of random kind of businesses in college. They really went anywhere. They were great formative learning experiences. And we did that when we were really young, 17, 18 years old, got to meet with so many amazing entrepreneurs in Boston and really kind of see how the sausage is made with a lot of these different businesses. And you learn so many of those lessons like experientially. It's so hard to like read a textbook on startups or something, right? Like you have to go chew glass, you have to go learn these things yourself. So by the time we made it out to San Francisco in our early 20s, we had seen a lot of what the startup life had to offer, but not kind of the full picture. And I was fortunate enough to go work at some amazing companies as an employee initially, to then go learn, okay, this is how you scale businesses. This is what it takes to, go from a Series A to Series D company. Like we got to see so much of that firsthand. And by being an engineer, it was getting my hands, how do you build things fast? How do you actually scale these tech platforms? And again, there was just so much learning so fast. And then from there, parlayed it into several of my first entrepreneurial journeys were in the SaaS space. So one of which that I don't know if I've talked about prior, but it was actually like in the weeds call center software, which is like really gross checkerboard style SaaS, and that was a great place to learn because you're selling essentially perfectly competitive products. So you can innovate on the edges, you can build new features, you can have better user experiences, but at the end of the day, you're trying to sell to very sophisticated buyers that have very established buying criteria. And doing that when you're really young, selling to large organizations is quite difficult, especially if you're trying to sell enterprise deals. But it taught me so much about not only just software engineering and building SaaS products at scale, but also how do you sell. And I think the killer combination for most folks is being able to either sell or build. And I'm very fortunate to be able to be very good at both. And I think that's kind of my unique combination and what I bring as, kind of a leader of crypto projects today. But I do think you become the kind of amalgamation of the 5 people that you spend the most time with. And I've been really fortunate over the last couple decades to constantly be refining that set to have, 5 to 10 people who are, movers and shakers of, real amazing businesses, not just in crypto, but in Web 2. And that's formed a lot of who I am today.
Let's say you meet a person and you're like, I want this person to be in my circle. How do you approach this person if you guys are not besties already?
So I've always been a believer in the pay it forward culture. And this is something that was ingrained into me at a very early age. But when you're trying to, find people that you want to work with, you try to find, how can I help you? And then in theory, maybe some of that will eventually come back around to you. But I actually don't really believe in transactional relationships. I think too much of crypto in particular is transactional, where people try to set up things where it's unfortunately a lot of like heads I win, tails you lose type scenarios versus, hey, how do we go win-win together? And I think by approaching it with an open mind and to go try to find things that you can work on together or things you might be able to do for other people, it comes back around. And I've been very fortunate with a lot of these relationships where you start doing something small together, you might help someone in some small way. And then in the future, you know exactly who to call for, some sort of thing down the line. And it's amazing to have built that rapport.
Okay, and that kind of aligns with this DAO kind of mentality. Is that correct?
I'd say it does and it doesn't. I think in general, like the DAO is less about paying it forward. It's more just new collaboration models, if you will, which you wind up being very collaborative in that way, but it's not kind of as explicit, if you will. The DAO at the end of the day has a very specific purpose, which is to grow the core network, to scale Bitcoin, like very kind of clearly defined. I think in a lot of these personal relationships, you actually don't know where it's going to go. You might meet someone, at some point or, at some event or whatever very early, and then they might be doing something totally different, 5-10 years from now. And that's actually, it's really funny. One of the folks that, Core partnered with very early is a group called Switchboard. Switchboard's an Oracle. They're live on Core, live on Solana. They've been around for a while. They're actually gearing up for their TGE, which of course we hope goes well. But I met Chris back in 2010, I think, at our time during Boston College. And we didn't reconnect until 2017 in a crypto context. So you never really know where these things will come from. But it's so powerful to build these long-term relationships.
You also worked at Coinbase as a money movement engineer.
Exchanges like Coinbase process, up to trillions of dollars in and out flows throughout a given year. And that's the total dollarized volume of all the crypto assets, all of the fiat, because there's so many different payment rails, so many different crypto assets. And that's very hard to do reliably at scale. Having been a customer of a centralized exchange, I'd assume at some point in the past, you've probably had that dreaded, where is my money feeling? And it's always confusing. Even if it only takes like another minute or two longer, it's scary, right? Because crypto, there's no take backs, right? These are bare assets. And I had the fortunate spot for about 4 years to run all of the money movements engineering at Coinbase. And it was a really amazing position to be in. I got to work with so many awesome people, go through the company's initial direct listing, et cetera. But it taught me a lot about let's call it the next level craft of software engineering and doing things at incredibly high scale. So if you're at the volume of a Coinbase or a Binance, like the dollarized volumes are really impressive, and small problems can be very expensive problems very, very quickly. And there's a customer service element of that I was also taught, very clearly, where in some other roles, hey, maybe it's okay if someone can't, access some SaaS tool for, like an hour or something. Well, if you think your money's gone and never getting it back, that's totally unacceptable, and people get really angry at you, and rightfully so. So it gave me kind of this commitment to quality, commitment to excellence that I had prior, but it really sharpened it, where when your team makes a mistake or something and your front page news on MSNBC, the stakes are a little different, but I enjoyed it. It was like kind of a crypto finishing school what I would say is kind of true to my earlier answer on being a 0 to 1 guy. I enjoyed, some of the earlier times at Coinbase, but as it got, a little more corporate, that sort of thing, that's when, it was time for me to find my next venture.
Take us back to the moment when you discovered Bitcoin, or the moment when you're like, hey, I can make this into a full-time job.
So I first heard about Bitcoin, I believe in 2011, from a college professor. And the first time I heard about it, it made no sense to me. It was in the context of computer security, and he was explaining solving the Byzantine generals problem in like a pretty academic level, if you would. And I was like, that's really interesting. No one's ever going to use money on the internet. Like, that doesn't make any sense, like a true, hard-headed kind of college student, type view. By 2013, I had really sat down to read the Bitcoin white paper again, more in detail. And then it really clicked for me, because it was, hey, how do you build an alternative to traditional financial system, a non-sovereign store of value? Now I started to get it, because it was this economic play on top of this crypto security play. All these different pieces were all kind of aligning. And that to me was where I was like, okay, this could potentially be something that totally changes the world. And at that point, Bitcoin was popular. People were talking about it, but it was nowhere near the size or importance that it is today on a global scale. And that's when I, decided, hey, this is something I want to put, my future career aspirations towards. And we just need to figure out kind of the right modality with which to do it. And then by the time Ethereum started to get popular, really in 2015-ish, 2014, 2015-ish, that's when the second leg of the understanding really clicked, which was, oh, now you can have programmable money, right? It's not just, kind of this value that you're sitting around. You can actually do full smart contracts. You can have tokens, all these sort of pieces started to come in together. And then by the 2017 cycle, I was like, this is what I'm going to spend the rest of my life on. So
Nice.
It's kind of this crawl, walk, run from the early Bitcoin, kind of baptism all the way through kind of understanding all that Ethereum was. And then now today being back in Bitcoin land, which, it's awesome to have come home to where it all started.
You know how Bitcoiners, a lot of them do not like the other altcoins. What are you like?
So I was definitely a Bitcoin maxi back in the day. I think a lot of folks kind of go through some sort of a spectrum where they start out a Bitcoin maxi, then they become kind of an altcoin everywhere maxi, and then they kind of go back. And it's a kind of a common thing where you get burned by so many of these things in crypto that just overpromise and underdeliver. And I think we've seen that in so many other cycles. My view is more that there's a lot of truly amazing crypto projects out there, and that this is now the cycle of delivery. And I think a lot of kind of the white paper hype and then the projects die type thing, or they can never be viable businesses type thing, I think is mostly dead, which is, I think, a good meta for to die out in general. And I think we should be looking at, can these be revenue generating platform businesses? And the analogy that I give a lot of people, which is unsexy, if you will, but a lot of the business of blockchain, at least from my point of view, it looks quite similar to Salesforce. And you're building a platform. It's purely usage-based pricing. Those are transaction fees. You're trying to attract a lot of developers. You also attract end users. You take rev shares in the form of these transaction fees back and forth. And it's a pretty simple business when you think about it at the end of the day. But if you can scale these, they're essentially zero marginal cost businesses that should be spitting off quite a bit of free cash flow. And that's what I'm excited about, is this product market fit, this next level of maturity in the blockchain space, where some of these ecosystems, we've already seen it. Look at Solana, look at Ethereum. These generate real cash flows, even by public company standards. And that's something that Core hopes to do in its journey as well, and something that we're definitely focused on doing.
Now, tell us about Core then.
So Core is the leading Bitcoin scaling solution. So it's got the largest Bitcoin DeFi ecosystem on one side, with about 1 billion in TVL, hundreds of thousands of daily active users. It's got 75% of the Bitcoin hash rate that's currently securing the Core network. And then it also has the largest real yield Bitcoin staking product, with about 800 million in Bitcoin that's earning passive yield. And the way to think about Core is, it's really the Bitcoin consumer chain, right? It's the place where you can go put your Bitcoin to work on one side, and that can be in full Bitcoin DeFi or in these more passive products like Bitcoin staking. And the idea is to have a product for at every stage of a Bitcoiner's journey, right? Some folks are ready to go into full Bitcoin DeFi today. The majority are maybe ready for Bitcoin staking, right? Different trust assumptions, different risk thresholds. But it's so important to meet these folks where they're at today versus to force them into things they're not ready for, because this is truly a multi-decade play. And the example that I tell most folks is if you look at the Ethereum comps relative to the Bitcoin comps, even just looking at the DeFi aspect, there should be 200 billion of Bitcoin that's in DeFi today, and we're not even remotely close to that. So let's say there's a 10x at least there, short term. Well, if you now say that I think Bitcoin is going to be worth maybe 10 plus trillion in the next 5 years, okay, now you're talking $1 trillion space. How many markets that are relatively untapped are $1 trillion in size today? There's not too many. And that's just such an exciting thing to really try to capture. And that's what Core is after by, building the Bitcoin consumer chain.
Can you explain what trust assumption is?
Correct. So the trust assumptions are what you're willing to trust in order to achieve some end. And I hate to use definitions as like how to explain it, but I think we can go through an example here, and we'll use Core's Bitcoin staking analogy to talk about it. So when you stake your Bitcoin in Core's product, you just time lock it to yourself using Bitcoin's native time lock functionality, which just locks up those funds from a technical level. You're just time locking a UTXO to yourself. You're never sending it to any multi-sig, etc. Now, what does that mean from a trust assumption point of view? It means you only have to trust Bitcoin. So you don't even have to trust Core because you're only trusting the native pieces of Bitcoin itself. Let's talk about maybe a different way to implement Bitcoin staking, which would be, let's call it via like a multi-sig or something else. Well, maybe for that, you actually have to send your Bitcoin somewhere else. Maybe even a better example would be like lending, right? Where you have to send it somewhere else and then they promise to pay you yield in the future. Well, now you have to trust that those people will actually give you your Bitcoin back in the future, right? That's the trust assumption that you're taking on. So the way to think about it, I guess maybe in a more like accounting sense, is like the accrued liabilities, right? And it's with each one of those, you have to be really certain that you're willing to exchange your Bitcoin or your crypto asset for whatever they're going to promise you on the other side. And just for me, having been in the crypto space for a long time, I don't like to trust. I like to verify. And I would never, put my own Bitcoin in some of these other products where I have to trust a third party, because that to me is just something that's an unacceptable risk no matter what they're paying me. But for other people that might be even farther out in the risk spectrum, they're willing to do so. But the key is to do what's right for you and where you're at. And I think there's a nice competitive pressure that Core is helping to bring on the space today, which is trying to reduce as many trust assumptions as possible, not just with staking, but with things like bridging as well.
That's very clear. That's why you said it's risk-free, because I've been watching your interviews and I was like, what do you mean by risk-free? Okay, that makes sense now. Would you compare that to, let's say, Lido, Ethereum? What would that look like?
In the Lido case, you're actually trusting a operator in order to go do that stake for you. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Lido has a really amazing reputation. There's a lot of social consensus that goes around that. They have an amazing operating history, but there is some sort of a trust that you're putting in, another group. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just something that people should think about. And I think an example of kind of how that plays out in the Core system, if you will, is there's a lot of Bitcoin LSTs that are now, becoming quite popular. And Core actually has its own LST BTC that will come out here relatively soon. And the idea is now for that, okay, you want to go take your yield-bearing asset and you want to go bring that into DeFi. Well, in order to do that, you have to take on other trust assumptions, because now there needs to be a derivative token that gets minted out of that. So you're trading off either custody with a multi-sig or like a tri-party or like MPC, et cetera, right? And with that, you're getting some additional utility out of it. And I think that's kind of how to think about, again, like when you checkerboard these different things, to go back to what I was talking to the beginning, am I getting what I desire? And am I willing to accept the different risks that come with it? And for a lot of people, they just want to stake. So it's amazing that you can go do that with no new trust assumptions. If you want to go further out of the yield curve, you want to go out there and get higher things, you're probably, at least today, going to have to go take on some new trust assumptions to go do so.
Okay, another question on time lock. So again, for newbies, what does that mean?
There's a Bitcoin opcode called check lock time verify. I believe it was introduced in 2015. So it's quite, it's quite ossified at this point. It's, it's battle tested and that sort of thing. And it's a very basic primitive. Like if you think about the scripting language of Bitcoin, it's very basic. You can only do kind of these small things, but there's enough primitives to be dangerous, if you will. And there's this whole, kind of world of Bitcoin script and these amazing engineers that are constantly figuring out how to expand the potential of what you can do with Bitcoin script, despite it being so limited. I think one of the great examples of that is all the amazing work being done like the BitVM space, right? Where it's like very limited, but you can actually build amazing pieces out of it. So one of these basic primitives, again, not related to BitVM stuff, but relevant to this context, is the ability to lock your Bitcoin. And that allows you to do like basic smart contracts to a degree, if you will, right? And this basic contract is, okay, I set a block time in the future, a block number in the future, and up until that point, that UTXO cannot be spent. And it essentially just prevents it from moving is kind of the way to think about it. And that's what you're doing as part of the staking piece is you're actually like encumbering those funds for some period of time. But that's why we say you only have to trust Bitcoin, because if you trust Bitcoin to be able to do check, lock, time, verify, that's the only piece of this that you have to trust working. There's no case where you're performing that and Core or some other bad actor is taking your principal, right? And that's what most people, historically have the issues with, where, hey, there's some piece of this where my principal actually gets at risk. And for most Bitcoiners, that's a totally unacceptable trade-off where they think Bitcoin is the most sacred, precious asset in the universe.
Okay, so from your perspective, let's say I time lock one BTC, and how does that benefit you if I don't send it to you?
So you're providing economic security to the core chain. So the way to think about it, if we go into kind of the Satoshi Plus mechanism again, so on one side, you've got the hash rate that's delegated to you. On the other side, you've got the core that's being staked to you. And then in this case, you've got the Bitcoin that's being staked to you. So as a validator, the more Bitcoin that you get staked to you, the more likely you are to get elected. And then by having there be a large quantum of Bitcoin that is staked to you, that makes it harder and harder for other bad actors to get elected into your validator set, right? And the idea is by having these three hard to get quantities, you make it difficult for these folks that want to perform, a malicious double sign or other sort of attack on your system to be able to actually get elected to that validator set. And we have three ingredients. You can think about it in like your Ethereum space and your Solana, et cetera, right? It's one ingredient. And again, it's not necessarily to say that, three is greater than one or whatever. They're just different models. But it's kind of that same idea, just applied to three different contexts, if you will.
If I have my Bitcoin in a ledger or in, decentralized wallet, how do I earn yield on Core? Like, what does it look like, the process?
So several different ways that you can go about generating this transaction. So you can go to stake.coredao.org. And on stake.coredao.org, there's like a whole kind of WYSIWYG UI. It shows you a calculator that shows you your staking rewards, and then it shows you how you can boost it with dual staking. So if you stake both Bitcoin and Core, you earn much higher rates of return. And this is one of the utilities that Core provides, is yield on your Bitcoin. So it's a really nice kind of symbiosis of these two different pieces. And then you can use Unisat, Xverse, et cetera, to go build that transaction and to go broadcast that onto the Bitcoin network. That's one way, and I'd say that that's the more common way that we see. And that's probably the more retail-focused way, if you will. And there's a bunch of hardware wallets, et cetera, that are integrating Core's Bitcoin staking to make that more seamless. We'll continue to do that throughout all of 2025. On your more institutional side, you've got a couple different options. What people will do is they'll work with their favorite custodian. So HexTrust, BitGo, like Copper, all these different ones that support Core today, and they make it really simple and easy to use. Or you can build your own transaction, and Core has a whole script that you can follow and write your own, et cetera, to go build that and then broadcast it yourself. So you have, again, going down the list of things, who do you trust? Which one makes it easy? Do you have it in cold storage or not, right? Like you go through kind of these different things and ultimately pick what's right for you. But there's a simple way for everybody that matches their goals.
So if you're a retail that, likes Bitcoin, has a few, which one is the easiest?
The easiest would be Unisat or Xverse, I believe. They've got pretty good support for this stuff.
So Bitcoin has been seen as a store of value. Do you think this view is a little outdated because BTC Fi is Bitcoin DeFi, right? So you actually have to put your Bitcoin to work. But, you see Bitcoin as this digital gold that you don't want to, show other people. You want to just keep it in a safe. Is that like a very outdated type of view, or what do you think?
So I don't think it's outdated. I think it's being updated slightly, if you will. So what I mean by that is it's the same store of value, just applied to new context. So if I go back to 2013, I thought we were going to use Bitcoin as a means of payment everywhere. And I bought a lot of very expensive coffees today. But what we saw throughout time is people don't really want to pay for things in volatile assets, right? Like there's just really not a lot of demand for it. Taxes aside, like you just don't want to pay for things that you think are going to go up in that current, like it's just a bad idea for the most part. So what have we learned? We've learned that it's actually amazing as a store of value or collateral asset. And we're seeing this on the nation state level today, right? You're hearing Trump and some of these other groups talk about a strategic Bitcoin reserve, and they want to have that, potentially to borrow against or to have, financial products around, but it's ultimately being used as a source of collateral. And I think that's what we're going to see on the retail side as well, where you have your Bitcoin. What you want to ultimately do is bring that into faster, cheaper rails like Core, and then you want to borrow against it, likely for stable coins. So again, the killer use case is really leverage, if you will, low LTV loans against your Bitcoins, pay your day-to-day bills, and then eventually pay it back. And I think that's how we actually realize the Bitcoin vision. And this is, again, what I've been thinking about for the last 11, 12 years now. But the whole idea was, how do you build an alternative traditional financial system? Well, now we have the possibility to go do that. Bitcoin's at the center of it. You're using it to go get stables. It can look like a neobank. And now your Bitcoin is earning interest as well, right? In the form of this yield from Core's non-custodial Bitcoin staking. So it's got all those pieces now. And the fact that you can do that at extremely fast, extremely cheap transactions on top of Core was kind of that other missing piece, because the majority of the world is priced out of using Bitcoin, the base layer. And I think that's how we actually onboard, let's call it, billions of people onto Bitcoin in the next 10 to 20 years. That's the shape of what it will look like. And you'll have a variety of other products that are maybe more Bitcoin DeFi, if you will, besides just lending and borrowing, that will be, all sorts of different things that we know from the Ethereum ecosystem, et cetera. But some of these initial use cases can be hundreds of billions, like at size, just like unfathomable numbers, at the size of Bitcoin DeFi today, but I think it looks small 3 to 5 years from now.
The yield is in Core token, is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, you just have to understand that the Core token, understand Core's yield. If you don't know what the yield is, you're the yield.
Okay, and you have a limited supply of 2.1 billion. And I want to know what happens, when all the tokens are mined. And how does that work afterwards?
So Core is a fixed supply token, and that was very deliberate to, one, kind of pay homage to Bitcoin, but also to give it more sustainable, monetary policy. And one of the things that we believe is, Bitcoin's monetary policy is so beautiful and so simple. It's just too extreme, if you will, for many of these use cases, where it hard ratchets by cutting itself in half every 4 years. We get those minor security budget crisis things every few years. Like we've all heard that story, many times now. And that was actually the original genesis of Core. It was to go be this second block reward for Bitcoin miners. And that's how 75% of the hash rate is currently secure in the Core network, because they get Core block rewards that helps them sustain, their profitability and kind of smooth out that profitability curve. And with Bitcoin staking, we gave them another tool in their toolkit, which is, okay, now I can go stake my Bitcoin, stake my Core, versus just sell my Bitcoin, sell my Core. So you give the miners, more and more freedom to kind of operate in the most efficient way possible for them. And retail also gets the benefit, as do institutions, from the same, Bitcoin staking product. All of that preamble aside, Core has a 81-year emissions curve, so it's very flat. And the idea is that it's this long-term sustainable yield versus be something more like yield farming. So as more and more Bitcoin or Core gets staked, there's no new tokens that get printed, like more or less. It's not, it's a fixed amount that gets printed. So it's very sound from that point of view, and it decreases by 3.6% a year or something. So it's like this very, kind of gradual decrease. And the idea is that over time, this system moves more and more to being based off transaction fees, right? Similar to what Bitcoin does, where the emissions decrease and more of the network is generating. And we do think over an 81-year time horizon that will flip, and you will have, hopefully long before that, but you will actually have a higher reward that's being paid out just on the transaction fees as time goes on. Very similar to what Bitcoin looks like, but slightly tweaked.
And earlier you said you don't actually have to trust Core, you just have to trust Bitcoin, right? So is there any risk, staking on Core or getting involved? Any risk?
So for Bitcoin staking, the only thing you have is duration risk or liquidity risk. And what I mean by that is if you're locking up those funds for at least a day, I believe is the minimum time, you can't go send that or trade it or something, right? So like there's only like liquidity from that point of view. Vast majority of folks that are doing Bitcoin staking do not have that in mind on like a 1 day time horizon, but it is important just to note that you cannot do both because you're actually locking up those funds on Bitcoin itself. When it comes to the full Bitcoin DeFi aspects of Core, that's a little bit of a different ballgame in that you're in a full EVM ecosystem, right? And what I mean by that is you need to do a ton of homework you should do your homework on everything in Web3, don't get me wrong, but you should look at, are these protocols audited? Many of the protocols on Core have 2 audits from, amazing firms like Halborn, et cetera, and like have, quite a bit of DD that's done into these, but you yourself as a user should always check into those to make sure that you're, again, going to something that you would trust with your own funds. But when you're in the EVM ecosystem, you can do so many more things besides just staking. Borrow, lend, you can perps trade, you can stake, you can go trade NFTs, like you name it, it's all available on Core. There's 100+ protocols that are live on Core today. There's more that are going live every day. So it really is like a fully fleshed out, very exciting place to go spend time in Web3, but always, not financial advice, do your own homework, that sort of thing. Really, you want to have a nice night out, you essentially do a just-in-time loan on your phone, and right when you get the bill, then you get stables in there, you pay for it, and then you kind of go pay it back over time. And I think that will be super seamless, super smooth. And it's, again, for billions of people around the world that have no access or very limited access to banking, it's a 0 to 1 experience for those folks. So if you're building that, definitely come talk to us. We'd love to chat with you.
I love that because, I don't all in BTC because I still want to be able to travel and stuff. But with this, hello, why not, right? Institutions, for example, MicroStrategy, they have a crazy amount of BTC. Can they actually use your service?
So I think we'll see some, and we've already announced some key institutional partners like Hashnode, and there's a few others that we'll talk about relatively soon. But now it's the idea of Bitcoin yield is now at the forefront. And I think this will be a big story for 2025 and beyond is the Overton window on Bitcoin really shifted with the ETF early last year. Now we're going to get into the next wave of Bitcoin, which is going to be structured products, derivatives, et cetera, on Bitcoin at true financial system scale versus just like crypto scale, which again is big, but it's like 3 trillion relative to derivatives market of hundreds of trillions in the traditional financial space. And I think that's a super exciting spot for us all to be trying to play in because that's just such a large market as well. Like derivatives getting 10 times the size of spot assets. So there's just so much potential opportunity there. And that's something that Core wants to power. So I think you'll see Bitcoin staking we've already got the first Bitcoin ETPs that are staking. I think we'll get some ETFs. And then you'll see some of these corporates that are not just staking their Bitcoin, but are probably doing some Bitcoin bonds, other Bitcoin derivatives. All of that can be powered by Core.
So this is more of a technical question. So let's say I am an institution, I have Bitcoin and I stake it on Core. How does the accounting look like? Do I earn revenue in Core and at the fiat price of Core token, or how does it work?
Disclaimer, not tax advice. But yeah, it's treated like any staking reward traditionally, right? So you pay taxes on the value you receive when it comes in. And at least in Core system, you do have a little bit of potential, depending on your jurisdiction, of when you claim it and that sort of thing, to like optimize that to some degree. But that is, one of the pieces that go into this, right, is you actually now have a yield generating asset. There are potentially tax consequences that go with it. Again, in theory, you're offsetting those, right? But it is something to be mindful of.
Again, another interview of yours, you said CoreFi is similar to a MicroStrategy style acquisition play for Core token. Is this what you mean, what you just said?
It's slightly different. CoreFi, we're super excited about, where it's a MicroStrategy for the Core token. And what we've seen is MicroStrategy has had such amazing, and Michael Saylor, such amazing impact in the Bitcoin space over the last few years. And that levered acquisition strategy has been really, really exciting for shareholders as well, right? Like MicroStrategy is one of the best performing stocks, maybe the best performing stock over like the last several years. That's super impressive. And then the convertible bonds have done really amazingly well. I think they've actually outperformed Bitcoin. And there was this, kind of idea with, some of our key partners, one of which is this group called DeFi Technologies, of, hey, why would we not do that with the most Bitcoin aligned chain, which is Core? And we said, hey, this sounds like a really great idea. This is something we should, think about partnering on. And that was kind of the genesis of CoreFi. And there's other one that is out there currently, and it's called Soul Strategies, I think. And they do this same strategy with Solana. And we all know how effective Solana's been over the last, little bit here. But we've never seen anyone approach something like this on an asset the size of Core, right? Core is 100 times smaller than Solana, many thousands of times smaller than Bitcoin. So I think we'll see kind of the strategy run at a very different scale, and we're super excited to see the results. It's also going to be helping to promote this dual staking, which is what we were chatting about there a second, where if you have Bitcoin and Core on your balance sheet, it's not just sitting idle. It's not just pure acquisition. You can also benefit from these net new staking rewards, and that compounds in a reflexive way. So dual staking, just to kind of quickly zoom in on that, it's actually leveraging two of those three pillars, because it's leveraging the Bitcoin staking and the Core staking. So if we kind of zoom out and we say, okay, Bitcoin staking is this amazing value that's being derived to Bitcoin holders. How does the Core community benefit? And the Core community benefits by blending the Bitcoin community and the Core community over time. Well, how do we do that? And that is what we refer to as Bitcoin alignment. Well, now, if you want to be a Bitcoin staker, you can just earn a low yield. If you just stake your Bitcoin, that'll always be available to you. But if you want to earn a higher yield, you now have to join the Core community, because you now have to have a position in Core as well. And this is how we blend these two groups over time. And the whole idea behind Core is Bitcoin alignment, right? It's the merging of these two communities. And this is kind of a walk in the crawl, walk, run. And if you think about like kind of going back to the spectrum of, Bitcoin, putting your Bitcoin to work spectrum, if you will, you have Bitcoin, I'm doing nothing with my Bitcoin on one side. That's a lot of folks. Then you have, I'm just willing to go stake my Bitcoin. That's the next biggest bucket. Dual staking is that middle ground, because it says, hey, I'm willing to go stake my Bitcoin, and I'm willing to take some principal risk in the form of the Core token in order to get higher rates of return on my Bitcoin. And Core and Bitcoin are correlated like 0.95 or something. So there's principal risk that's directionally aligned with Bitcoin. You would do that with what you will. And then the final step of that is Bitcoin DeFi, where you wrap or you bridge or you come over, and that's the smallest segment today. So this is really meant to help bring people along that spectrum and allow them to earn DeFi yields, if you will, or DeFi-like yields without actually having to go into full-blown DeFi.
So people that stake BTC at the second stage, they will earn yield in Core, and then, they will join the Core community automatically, kind of.
If they restake that. So it's a good question. Is like for some of these people, they want to join and they want to do that. Other people go transfer it into some other asset or do whatever. But yes, one of the things that we've seen since dual staking went live was quite a bit of these folks that were just staking Bitcoin have now actually kind of become full dual stakers, which has been awesome to watch. And we think that pattern will continue. And now the Core community is directly benefiting even more from these Bitcoin stakers beyond just the security that they were providing.
That's awesome. Genius. Did you come up with this whole thing?
Core is a decentralized organization with so many smart people, thousands of people around the world that have played some active role in the Core community, and then of course millions of people overall. But this was a hard-fought problem, many hours kind of thinking through it. But Core has always had a very clear guiding light, which is, again, how do we scale Bitcoin? How do we build this POS layer on top of Bitcoin? And there's been kind of a clear ABC type kind of roadmap that we've had in place. And it's been great to not only stay true to that, but to see the awesome reception as these products hit mass appeal.
How does a DAO work? when you make a decision?
So there's no one size fits all, I think, with DAOs. And we've seen a lot of really inefficient DAOs and that sort of thing over the last few years. I do think it will come back in 2025. I think there's been a lot of haters, but I do think it will come back. In Core's case, it's about 80 people that work, kind of full time on different aspects of Core itself. Then there's hundreds of ambassadors. It goes out from there, kind of like a pyramid in terms of the amount of people that are involved in some way, shape, or form. Of course, with the community as the base of that, where there's, almost 10 million Core community members at this point. And everyone contributes in their own way, even the community members, right? They can be answering questions, they can be using Core protocols. And the idea is you're building a movement that's, maybe 10 million today, but needs to get to 100 million, over time, right? It needs to grow really rapidly. But with that, we're in this process of progressive decentralization. And the idea is at kind of the beginning stages, so you've got a smaller group of folks that are kind of responsible for some of the more day-to-day pieces. And then over time, you open up more and more pieces to on-chain governance before you fully get to on-chain governance. And there'll be a bunch of progress that will continue on the 2024 progress. I won't give too many spoilers, but there's a whole new governance thing to be on the lookout for in early Q1 here. But it's a big focus for us because we do believe that Bitcoin is the most decentralized chain. It's why Core did a fair launch. And we do believe that this is a community-run project and always will be. And that is just, it amplifies the potential of what this can be, not just on an economic level, but also a social, political, etc. level.
At Coinbase, the product market fit for crypto was forgetting your wallet password. So if that's the case, right, how do we even scale DeFi and make it, seamless?
So I still very much believe that, maybe to the chagrin of some of my former coworkers. And I think the product's actually come a long way since I've been there. So probably because I left, it got that much better. But in general, I think a lot of crypto has been Rube Goldberg machines where you're trying to make things so novel, so innovative, you're just missing what people actually want. And I think we're past that because I think the market, A, no longer really rewards that, but B, there's not as much left, I think, in that tank, right? It's now about how do we actually scale things. And one of the things that Core prides itself on is being a product-focused blockchain versus a research-focused blockchain, meaning that our goal is build stuff people want versus, maybe write the newest, most novel, theory, which is not to say that there's not value in that. It's just most of that gets commoditized. And that commoditization is inevitable. And what ultimately comes back is the durable value. Do you actually have users? Do you actually have TVL? Do you have these two things intermixing? Are people using your protocols? And that's such a different viewpoint from many of these other chains. And I think long term is such a differentiator for us. But to kind of go back to the root of the question, how do we get there? We have to just build stuff people want, talk to users, do the basic in the trenches work. And for so much of crypto, for so long, it's been, if you build it, they will come, right? It's been this let me pontificate kind of the future of finance to you and whatever. And the graveyard of crypto projects where that's been done is pretty vast at this point. And we just fundamentally don't believe that's the way to approach it. And if people want to continue on the old approach, be our guest. We'll continue to eat your lunch.
So when you say build product people want, who's people? Is it 30-year-olds, 80, 70, grandma, grandpa? Who are we talking about?
So I think it can really be almost anybody, and I'll include AI agents in there. I've got this whole Bitcoin is AI money thing, but that's a future podcast probably. But in general, and it's one of the reasons that I love Bitcoin is it is so universally applicable. There's not anybody that I know of that doesn't want a perfect collateral asset. It's just too useful, if you will, at the end of the day. And then I think it comes down to, okay, what are the products and services that can get built on top of it? We talked a little bit about neobanking. There's a whole different variety of different DeFi primitives that are very appealing to many different groups. It's a whole other aspect of folks that want, gaming, more day-to-day applications. But I think the scope of that is quite broad. And I think it's important to keep experimenting. So much of crypto is kind of throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks. And I think we're so early in the experimentation phase, not just for Core, but all of crypto, that we really haven't seen too many of these breakout use cases beyond finance. That's an enormous space in amongst itself, but there's still so much left to be done there. And that's something that, we encourage so many builders to keep experimenting, to go find new things. And then the other side, Core is also marketing, super actively to developers. Because at the end of the day, the strength of your ecosystem, you need amazing developers that want to have coordinated projects, that want to build from the long term, and that critically want to build real businesses. So that same philosophy that we have at the platform level is the same thing we ask of our builders. If you're just kind of building something just to launch a token and be done, you're probably not a good fit for Core. Because those businesses, I just don't think fundamentally have staying power. And I think, again, people are smart and kind of see through those things. And so many of these businesses can be cash flow positive really quickly. Like, these actually can be durable businesses. And Core's done some pretty innovative things with our Ignition program that rewards users and builders. And in Q1 here, we're going to talk about some pretty interesting revenue redistribution mechanics at the platform level that will allow some of these businesses to sustain potentially, without tokens at all, which is, pretty exciting.
Do you have competitors, or do you see this as a pie that everybody can just share a piece of?
So the Bitcoin space itself is absolutely enormous. And I think we're in this really interesting spot where so many folks are trying to view it as zero sum when it's just an absolutely monstrous space. We have competitors, of course, but we honestly don't pay much attention. We continue to run our own race. At the end of the day, there's more than enough for, many large Bitcoin chains out there. We do think there will be a power law in terms of, the ultimate size of different winners. But what we care about is actual adoption, actual usage, real protocols. And I think the litmus test that, I have talked about, in the past as well is go look at the block explorers for actual usage and activity on many of these, Bitcoin scaling solutions. And you'll see that they're just ghost chains already. And if you're at a ghost chain pre-TGE and everything else, like my odds are not super high that becomes something that has real staying power. But I think many of these people need to stop pitchforking each other and that sort of thing and just say, hey, how do we collaborate and, cooperate, if you will, in order to build something big? And I think that's definitely a focus for Core in 2025. I think many of these groups, that view us as competitive, we probably view as potential partners. And there's just so much opportunity here to build something enormous. And I don't think it's like an N of one style play. I think it's a one of N, where the entire, let's call it, top 50 by most metrics in crypto will be dominated by Bitcoin scaling solutions in the next 3 to 5 years.
So what's the difference when it comes to communicating with Web 2 users versus these degen Web 3 users? I would assume it's education and a lot of explaining.
So I refer to myself as the chief education officer for
I
Core.
love that.
Don't quote me, but that is one that I use pretty often. And it's not just educating Web 2 or Web 3, it's educating everyone. Like, for the last 16 years, happy birthday Bitcoin, people have forever just thought about it as like kind of a pet rock. And that pet rock has gone up in money or gone up in value for the last, every year. And that's been awesome. But now you can use it for so much more. So even for some of your hardcore degens and that sort of thing, we're having your, Bitcoin scaling 101 conversation, and that's totally cool. And that's how we approach, kind of all these, whether it's with the largest financial institutions in the world or a new Web 2 person or whomever. Here's what Bitcoin is. Here's why it's so special. Here's the value props. Oh, you've already got that module down? Okay, let's go into the right. But you kind of take it step by step. And that's what we found out to be, super impactful overall, is meeting people where they're at. If we try to just bury you with kind of the latest and greatest, Web3 farming trends or something, you're actually going to scare away vast majority of people out there that, get scared when they hear about things like yield, right? You have to kind of meet people where they're at and ultimately help bring them along that journey. And that's also why I talk about that continuum all the time, about bringing people along their journey, because the quickest way to destroy trust, and of course, I've made this mistake as well, is if you try to bring people too far along that spectrum before they're ready. And that's one of the reasons that we do have products that are, all along the spectrum, because you have to allow people to mature at their own pace. And you can, of course, try to add gas or add emphasis. But unless people understand it, you're going to wind up with upset users. And that, unfortunately, is how you wind up building something that doesn't quite work.
Does talking to institution and talking to like a retail person, do you use different words or different logic, different reasoning, or are they all the same?
Really depends. I think it's hard to be that broad, if you will, because even if you go into different financial institutions, like they have totally different mindsets and so many different educational pieces. We're really lucky that there's a good understanding of Bitcoin today. Like that, a lot of that hard work was done for us. And we can then use that as the entry part to that story and then talking about adding utility onto Bitcoin and like, but it's nice to have that base layer done. I think if we didn't have that, it'd be a much harder conversation with a lot of these different folks. But with some of these actors, even though they might understand Bitcoin, they've got very different levels of sophistication when it comes to DeFi or staking. So we do try to approach it in very like nuts and bolts kind of 101 pieces for everybody. But they, of course, have their own questions, tangents that you go down, etc. And we learn a lot as part of every conversation.
So two very common questions I got for people. How do you know Bitcoin is not all made up? Because you can't see it. You say it's digital gold, but for gold, at least you can wear it as a jewelry. You can put it in chips, but you can't see Bitcoin. You don't even know who made Bitcoin. So, and I'm like, I explain it in a way like hard money, and that's the Michael Saylor type of explanation. But I want to know how you would explain or address this to newcomers.
So this was I can't remember when I stopped getting this question. Maybe it was like 2021 or something. Like my family used to ask me this stuff all the time.
Right.
And like,
Right.
And you would always get like but the U.S. the U.S. dollar is like backed by the U.S. military or like you know whatever, and you get to these like non-falsifiable points. I think which are like largely true in some ways, but I think kind of how I think about it is most things in the world have value that is hard to quantify. And it's really difficult, like beyond the Saylor like economic arguments, if you will, which like a lot of people just discount. But I, again, could not agree more of, where you have provable scarcity, everything else. You can just talk about things like paintings or other things where it's like, how do you put a value on that? And people will try to give you a framework and whatever, but it eventually will boil down to subjectivity. And I think that's the other like non-falsifiable hypothesis that you can use to like kind of end that conversation, where it's like, okay, everything that has value is ultimately subjective. And if you can bring people to that level of reasoning, like it usually kind of kills the stump to stumper type game that people play. But I eventually just got tired of it, because like you either understand the economics of it and you're like willing to be a good faith actor, or you want to just like kind of play one of those games that's annoying. But yeah, that was one of my favorites, was using fine art or those sorts of things as a retort.
Bitcoiners, they see Bitcoin as the store of value, and there are people that desire more utility and they want to use Core. Can you tell us more or take us to the challenges that you guys might have, or the conversations you might have with, the other side of the community?
So I think one of the most early insights that we had that was really, really useful was that people think about Bitcoiners as one group. And that is just a very flawed assumption. Bitcoiners are totally heterogeneous. And it now is so mainstream that you've got heads of state, nation states that have Bitcoin, and then you have, kids that are in there like, I don't know, like 10 years old or something that big, right? Like how do you view that group as like the same, right? And you can't, is the ultimate answer. And that led us down this journey of building different products, different educational materials for everybody that's on that step, because that's a mistake that many of our competitors, and of course we've made, at previous times in the past, where if you try to square peg in a round hole or treat these folks as one group, you're ultimately going to lead to pain. Because people have different things they're willing to do or willing to accept. And if you try to force them along, again, you'll wind up with upset, customers. And a good example of this is if you look at, kind of BTC-Fi in general, Core fully acknowledges that BTC-Fi is like maybe a $100 billion opportunity today. I think Bitcoin DeFi will become a $1 trillion opportunity not far from now, but we are not there yet. And I think if you look at some of these other groups, it's like, well, what if I pull all of Bitcoin over here tomorrow? And just in reality, that's not going to happen. And we, talk to people all the time. It's like, I would love that more than anybody else, like don't get me wrong. But if you live in the real world, you understand that is just not where we're at today. And Bitcoin DeFi is going to be a story not just of this cycle, but of next cycle. And like maybe that's when it hits, kind of the truly crazy, adoption scale that we're looking for, and like the hundreds of millions or billions of people. But in terms of like addressing these different groups of the community, it's all about expectation setting, talking about how we are Bitcoiners building for Bitcoin, and we're actually working in the weeds to go improve kind of the potential utility of Bitcoin versus trying to take away or damage the base layer or do any of these other things that they might view as parasitic, if you would. And we have a fairly high conversion rate as part of those conversations, provided we're having like good faith discussions, right? And you can have good, bad faith discussions with Ethereum community members, Solana community, you name it, right? But that's been a great and eye-opening experience for us. And we've had these conversations with some of the largest, most famous Bitcoin holders. And it's just a process of, kind of level setting and having good faith discussion.
Anything exciting that is happening at Core or will be happening soon?
2025 is definitely a big year of scale for us. So again, we had like 300x TVL growth and that sort of thing last year, which was awesome. It was really like our coming out party. It was something like 50x, I think, growth in daily active users. Next year is how do we go 10x that again, right? And like how do we go from not just being the biggest Bitcoin scaling chain, which we're at right now, but to one of the largest chains overall. And we have really ambitious goals to go do that. And you're going to see more and more adoption, more and more protocols. Like we couldn't be any more excited about what 2025 has in store, from like a macro level, if you will. In Q1, we're super excited that the first implementation of local fee markets will go live on Core. So if you're not spamming the network, you'll have faster, cheaper transactions, regardless of like network congestion. We're super fired up about that. We're going to do some very interesting revenue redistribution plays where if you're interacting with certain dApps or stablecoins, et cetera, you'll have different economic principles applied to it. So we're super excited about that. We'll probably do a whole podcast on that at some point and go into like the different nitty gritty and the technicals. But it's the idea is like, how do we build the best platform? Again, not just for Bitcoin, but for any builder in the space as we go approach more and more builders and have more and more people launch stuff on top of Core. There'll be a whole host of partnerships in Q1, more custodians getting announced, different providers, different funds taking positions in dual staking. It should be action-packed.
I want to know your thoughts on this cycle. So do you think a super cycle is coming because, with Michael Saylor meeting Eric Trump, Trump is going to be in office in a few days. I don't know. People are super stoked that, an omega or like a God candle is incoming. But on the other hand, there are people saying, hey, it's still like a 4-year cycle where you go from Bitcoin and then Ethereum, big caps, small caps. Which one is true?
Man, I wish I knew the answer to that. But again, not financial advice. And of course, by saying that magic phrase, like it absolves me of all things. But in terms of like kind of this cycle being different, I would agree with, because I think we have this more or less fixed capital base in these ETFs that continues to grow, right? It's 100 billion now, it'll continue to grow. And I think it is genuinely, this cycle is different. How that impacts, is it 5 years now, 6 years, super cycle, like that part I think is really hard to tell, but I do think there is a structural shift in demand, particularly for Bitcoin, right? And like, there's a lot of talk about nation states buying Bitcoin. And I know that folks, Bitcoin Magazine have been talking a lot about that. And I think we will see like, there is a demand curve shift adjustment that's occurred in Bitcoin. And I think that will flow through to some other crypto assets. Does it do the traditional big cap, mid cap? Like, I don't know as much. I wish I did. But I do think a lot of the former cyclical pieces will take place, but I could be maybe drawn out or elongated based on some of these new drivers.
Do you see game theory playing out? Nation states game theory, as US started their, Bitcoin National Reserve, other countries are going to rush in.
I'm very intrigued to see it. I think in general, game theory is like one of those useful things for anybody to understand and appreciate, especially anybody that works in crypto. I do think when you see like G7 countries starting to acquire Bitcoin, like no one has any idea what that's going to do, like in terms of just the bid for Bitcoin. But there's a whole bunch of other maybe pretty negative externalities that people aren't talking about. Okay, do you get confiscation in some countries? Do you get like, you get to a lot of these weird things where, hey, maybe it's not so good to get there overnight. And, one of the questions that I got from people, particularly last year was like, when are we going to get $1 million Bitcoin? And I was like, well, I hope it's not this year, Because if it's this year, like, I don't know, like the world is burning around us or whatever, you know, like you don't want to things to happen too quickly, if you will. But I do think that it will, whether it's the US doing it first or a G7 country, you will see that, and it will just change the Bitcoin market forever. And I don't know, what does that make the price? I couldn't tell you. But I think it will be like a Bitcoin shortage, very different setup for us all.
So you think it will be happening? I hope it happens.
I don't know if it happens next year, the following year. Like, it's really hard to kind of price these things of when it does occur. But it just takes one or two interesting countries that decide to go do it. I mean, you've already seen Russia talk about, nationalized Bitcoin mining, so there's a few of these where, and again, maybe people are already secretly accumulating. I know that David Bailey's been talking about that. So yeah, I'm really intrigued for it. I don't know if it's a 2025 thing or not, but I'm excited for it.
Okay, so Bitcoin is pretty expensive now compared to before. Let's say a person that just got into Bitcoin and doesn't have a lot of money, but want to get involved. How does this person start?
So I remember this from back in the day as well, and like I'm happy that like Coinbase, Robinhood, et cetera, have done like a better job with their UIs and making it easier. But I remember forever being like, people telling me like, I can't buy one Bitcoin or whatever, and be like, you don't need to buy one. Like you can buy less at a time. And I think a good piece of advice over the last now 16 years there has been like DCA, right? Like if you're trying to accumulate a Bitcoin position, like just buy small amounts all the time, provided transaction fees are cheap or whatever. And that's a great way to get involved in like the building your own Bitcoin stack or really any crypto asset stack. In terms of the, how can you get involved? I think joining the communities is pretty important, and understanding where you can add unique value. And that can be in DeFi projects, it can be different L1s or L2s or whatever, but you kind of find, your tribe in crypto. For a lot of people, that is Bitcoin, and that's great. You can contribute to open source projects. There's all different ways you can get involved. But I think trying to promote crypto assets, writ large, is a great use of folks' time, and I think will be, very rewarding on a long enough time horizon.
Let's say I am interested in joining Core community. How do I do that? Do I join the Discord? Do I reach out to other members? How does it work?
Joining the Discord is a great way to get started. There's hundreds of thousands of people that are in the Discord, probably have asked a lot of similar questions to what you have, et cetera. And there's so many different ways you can get involved, whether it's, just being kind of a passive member of the community, whether it's staking, whether it's becoming an ambassador. Like, there's so many different ways, but the Discord is a great first landing spot. And one of the things that, we preach is there's no such thing as too small of a contribution. And I don't think enough crypto projects kind of share this mentality or popularize it, but crypto is a very democratic technology, and it should be totally open and egalitarian, and anybody should be able to participate. So no matter how you contribute, even if it's just, very basic things like translating something in your native language or whatever else, like that's a meaningful contribution. And I think it's nice for people to be able to start to contribute their own way, crawl, walk, run. And it's a great way to get to know people that share similar, beliefs, goals, etc.
I think because we're in crypto, so this concept is it's very common, right? But for a person that has never been in crypto or understanding the culture, it would feel very strange to just join a community and start contributing. And they're like, because people still want to be seen. So I'm doing this for this community. How am I seen? Like, do I get like a little star next to my name, or what do I get from this contribution?
So a lot of the benefits are like tacit, if you will, but there are different roles and things like that in Discord, which of course people, place value on. There's different things you can do on Twitter to get involved, and eventually maybe, join one of the different core communities that has like those organization groups. So there's all different ways that you can do that for kind of like the public aspect of it, if you will. And for a lot of people that does really matter, and there's a bunch of different paths with which to go do it. My kind of advice to anybody out there, regardless of crypto or not, or whatever, it's like, do great work and you get rewarded. And that's usually just a great way to kind of approach things, be open-minded, be long-term oriented, and good things happen.
And you make good friends.
Totally. Relationships are everything.
I really enjoy this conversation. Is there anything else you would like to add? Anything about Core or something that we missed?
So I think this is a fantastic interview. Really looking forward to doing it again sometime in the future. But I think definitely, go check out Core. You can follow us at CoreDAO_org on Twitter or CoreDAO.org. and go check out some of the different educational materials, join the Discord, start staking. Like, there's so many different ways to get involved, and it's never too late to get involved in these communities. So definitely get in touch and get involved.